You do not remember the moment your eyes closed for what everyone believed was the last time. You only remember the cold, a cold that did not feel like sleep, a cold that felt like the world had simply decided to stop including you. The physician came before the priest that night. This was unusual. In medieval England, the priest almost always arrived first. The fact that the physician came first means someone in that room was not yet ready to call it finished. That detail will matter later. The mirror test. Medieval physicians used polished metal held beneath the nose to detect breath. It was considered the most reliable method available. If the mirror clouded, you lived. If it stayed clear, you did not. The mirror stayed clear. But here is what nobody in that room understood. The mirror test had a failure rate that historians now estimate as terrifyingly high. Almost nobody knows this instrument existed. Medieval physicians in England had a version of the listening tube as early as the 13th century. It was crude, it was unreliable, but it existed. The physician pressed it to the chest of the man on the bed and listened. And in that stone room, with the wind outside and the candle bending, he heard nothing. Here is the fact that changes everything. In medieval England, a person could fall into a state of such profound unconsciousness from illness, shock, or certain infections that every available medical test of the era would confirm death. The heart slows to near nothing. The breath becomes so shallow it is invisible to any instrument available in 1349. The body cools, the eyes remain closed, and nobody, not the physician, not the priest, not the family, would know the difference. The carpenter received the order before sunrise. In medieval England, this was how it worked. The physician confirmed the death. The family sent word before dawn. The carpenter began the box before the body had fully cooled, because the church required burial within 24 hours, sometimes less. The speed was not cruelty, it was theology. Get the soul to God quickly. Do not let the body linger. This urgency, this holy, well-intentioned urgency, is the reason the box gets built before anyone asks the question that should always be asked first. The medieval carpenter's tools have not changed as much as you would think. The adze, the draw knife, the mortise chisel, the mallet. Every tool in that workshop was designed to work wood quickly and with precision. A skilled medieval carpenter could produce a burial box in under 3 hours. They had practice. In 1349 England, during the Black Death, they had a great deal of practice. The box was built to the measurement of a man the carpenter had never seen. This was standard practice. The family sent the measurements, height, shoulder width. The carpenter made the box fit. What the carpenter never knew, what nobody told the carpenter, was that the man whose measurements had been sent across the village in the dark had blinked twice while the physician was putting on his cloak to leave. The eyelid moved at approximately 5 in the morning. Nobody saw it. The older woman had fallen asleep in the chair. The younger woman had gone to wake the priest. The thin, pale man was not dead. His brain was fighting its way back through something it had nearly not returned from, and in the time it would take him to reach the surface, the box would be finished. The priest was told the man had been confirmed dead by the physician. In medieval England, this was sufficient. The priest did not re-examine the body. This was not negligence by medieval standards. It was the established order of things. The physician confirmed, the priest performed, the carpenter built, each part of the machine moving in its proper sequence. The machine had no step that said, "Wait, ask again, make certain." The joinery method used in medieval England for burial boxes was mortise and tenon, wooden pegs driven into drilled holes, no metal at the corners, fast, strong, permanent. Once those corner pegs were driven in and the wood swelled around them, the box could not be opened without destroying it. The carpenter drove the last corner peg at approximately 7 in the morning. Inside the stone room across the village, the thin, pale man's right hand moved. Catalepsy. This is the medical term for the condition that medieval physicians had no name for. A profound state of suspended animation triggered by severe illness, extreme trauma, or certain infections. The body's systems reduced to their absolute minimum, heartbeat near undetectable, breathing invisible, body temperature dropping, the brain still alive, firing in darkness with no way to signal the outside world. The fingers curled on the blanket at 7:15 in the morning. The box was finished at 7:40. Here is the detail that separates this burial from thousands of others happening across England in 1349. The family had asked for the bell string. This was not yet common practice. It would not become widespread for another 4 centuries, but in some parts of medieval England, there existed a crude version of the safety device, a thin cord attached to the wrist of the person inside the box, running through a small hole in the lid, attached to a small bell mounted above ground. If the person inside moved, the bell rang. The brother had requested the bell string himself. He was the one who had heard the stories. A traveling merchant had passed through the village 2 seasons ago and told of a woman in the north of England who had been taken from her coffin 3 days after burial, alive, because a gravedigger heard movement below. The brother had not forgotten this story. He had insisted. The physician had called it superstition. The priest had called it unnecessary. The brother had insisted anyway. This single insistence is the reason for everything that happens next. The brother stood at the bedside for 11 minutes without moving. He told this to the priest later in exact detail because the brother was the kind of man who noticed time. He said he stood there because he was waiting for something he could not name. Not a miracle, not a breath, just something. And in the 11th minute of standing there, he saw the eyelid move. The eyelid moved a second time as the brother watched, and then the right hand, the hand that had curled slightly on the blanket 2 hours earlier, moved again, deliberately this time, the fingers pressing flat against the wool, the pressure of a person trying to feel where they are. The brother turned to the door and called out into the street. He did not go for the physician, he went for the priest, because in England in 1349, the priest was the authority over the dead, and only the priest could stop what was already in motion. He had approximately 40 minutes. This is the window that historical records of similar cases suggest existed between the confirmation of death and the preparation of the body for burial. 40 minutes in which the physician's conclusion could be reversed. 40 minutes in which the priest could hold the burial order. The narrow brother reached the church in less than 4 minutes. The priest was not there. The priest was at the home of another confirmed death, 3 streets away, and in the carpenter's workshop, the bell string was being attached to the box. The cord was tested by pulling it sharply 3 times. Each time, the bell rang, a small, clear sound. The carpenter was satisfied. The bell string worked exactly as intended. What neither the carpenter nor anyone else in that workshop knew, and what would only be discovered much later in the examination of historical records, was that between the tying of the cord and the delivery of the box, something happened to the cord that nobody intended and nobody admitted to. The priest asked the brother one question. He asked, "Did the physician see what you saw?" The brother said no. The physician had already left the village for the next call. There were many calls in England in 1349. The priest then asked, "Are you certain of what you saw?" The brother said he was. The priest looked at him for a long time. Then the priest said, "I will come." But he did not move immediately. He turned to close the liturgical book on the stone lectern first. That turn took 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, the box left the carpenter's workshop. The box was carried through the street at the exact same moment the priest was walking in the opposite direction toward the stone house. They were on parallel streets. They never crossed. The priest arrived at the stone house to find the older woman in the dark brown wool dress standing in the doorway already dressed for the burial service. The box arrived at the stone house from the opposite side street 2 minutes later, and inside the stone house, on the wooden bed, the thin, pale man in his late 30s opened his eyes for the first time. The first thing you see is gray light. Not the gray of death, the gray of an English morning through a stone window. The first sensation is weight, the weight of your own body pressing into the bed beneath you, a sensation so ordinary and so enormous at the same time that your mind cannot immediately process it as real. The second sensation is cold, the specific cold of a room where the fire has been left to go out because nobody expected the room to be needed for living in anymore. You try to speak. Nothing comes out. This is one of the most documented aspects of recovery from cataleptic states in historical records. The voice returns last. The muscles of the throat and larynx require longer to reactivate than the limbs. You can feel the words attempting to form. You can feel the need to make sound, but your throat produces only a dry, almost nothing that would not carry to the next room, let alone through stone walls, to the woman speaking with someone at your door. 4 different people arrived at the door of that stone house within the same 2-minute window. The priest coming to look at the possibly living man, the carpenter bringing the box to receive the man confirmed dead, the narrow brother running back to stop the process he had partially started, the younger reddish-haired woman emerging from inside the house, coming to say that the man in the bed had just moved his arm. The 4 of them met at the door, and for a moment the machine stopped. The priest made a decision in approximately 15 seconds that changed everything. He stepped through the doorway and into the stone house to look at the man on the bed himself. This was the correct decision. This was the decision that should have been made 8 hours earlier. He walked through the house entrance and through the inner doorway, and he stood at the foot of the wooden bed, and he looked at the thin, pale man lying there, and the thin, pale man looked back at him. The priest said later that the man on the bed looked at him with the eyes of someone who had been somewhere very far away and was not yet certain he had returned. The priest said he felt something he could not find a theological word for, which for a medieval English priest was an extraordinary admission. He said he felt the specific wrongness of having almost done something that could not be undone. And then he turned and told the older woman to boil water and send for the physician immediately. Here's the thing about the bell string that nobody mentions in the standard historical account of this case. When the box was set down on the cobblestones outside the house and the carpenter was told it would not be needed, one of the younger men reached into the box through the lid to retrieve the braided linen cord for reuse on the next commission. And when he pulled the cord up through the hole, the cord came up in 2 pieces. The knot inside the box had failed, or had been cut. The cord that was supposed to give the man inside a way to signal the world had been severed somewhere between the workshop and the street. A failed knot does not produce a clean end. A cord broken under the tension of a bell being pulled produces a frayed, irregular break, the individual linen threads separating at different points. What the younger man was holding were 2 pieces of cord with ends so clean and even that only one thing produces that result. The cord had been cut deliberately by something with an iron edge at some point between the workshop and the street. When the box was unattended, or when someone had access to it who wished to ensure that if the man inside the box was not dead when he went in, he would not be able to signal anyone to that fact. Nobody spoke about the cut cord that morning, not aloud, not to the priest, not to each other. The carpenter took both pieces from the younger man's hand and put them in the pocket of the leather apron and said nothing. This is itself a fact that sits in the historical record of this case like a stone in water, visible under the surface if you know where to look. The cord was cut. Nobody claimed the cutting. Nobody was accused of the cutting. The man inside the stone house was alive, and the question of who had decided he should not be was left to dissolve in the morning rain. The thin, pale man in his late 30s could not speak properly for another 2 hours. His voice, when it came back in fragments, single words, then short phrases, then eventually sentences. The first full sentence he spoke, the priest recorded this, was not a question about what had happened to him. It was not a request for water or warmth or a name called out for someone he loved. The first full sentence he spoke was, "How long was I gone?" And when the priest told him, the thin, pale man closed his eyes again, not from weakness, from something else entirely. What does a person think about in the first minutes of understanding they were almost buried alive? Historical accounts of similar cases from later centuries describe a specific and consistent psychological sequence. First, physical inventory, the confirmation that the body exists and functions. Second, temporal confusion, the inability to account for the lost hours. Third, and this is the one that stays, the question of the box. Not the fear of being inside it, the knowledge of how close the box came. The knowledge that the machine was already moving, and the question, always the same question, what stopped it? The narrow brother had insisted on the bell string. This is the fact the thin, pale man was told. The narrow brother had insisted, and the physician had called it superstition, and the priest had called it unnecessary, and the narrow brother had insisted anyway. What the thin, pale man was not told, what he would not learn for another 3 days when the carpenter said something to his wife, who said something to her neighbor, who said something to the older woman in the dark brown wool dress, was that the cord had been cut. The grave was already being dug. Nobody had told the grave diggers to stop. The machine has many parts, and they do not all receive the same information at the same time. The two grave diggers worked in the rain for another 40 minutes before the priest's young assistant arrived at the graveyard with the message that the burial was canceled. One of the grave diggers, on receiving this news, said nothing. He put his spade over his shoulder and walked away. The other one stood at the edge of the open grave for a long moment and looked down into it. Then he also walked away. This is the detail that the human mind resists when it hears this story. Not the catalepsy, not the failed medical tests, not even the cut cord. The detail the mind resists is the grave. The grave was already dug. The box was already built. The priest had already said the preliminary words. The machine was 20 minutes from completion. And the only reason the machine did not complete was a man's eyelid moving in a pale gray morning light, and a brother who had heard a story about a woman in the north, and 11 minutes of standing at a bedside waiting for something he could not name. The physician arrived at midday. He examined the thin, pale man thoroughly, using every instrument in his leather satchel. He asked questions and received answers in the thin, pale man's returning voice. He checked the pulse with 2 fingers against the wrist for a full minute, a minute the physician counted aloud. He checked the mirror again, held it beneath the nose, and this time it clouded immediately with visible breath. He packed his instruments and said 3 words to the older woman in the dark brown wool dress on his way out. He said, "I was wrong." The carpenter sat with the box for a long time that afternoon. What the carpenter was thinking is not recorded. What is recorded, in the carpenter's own account given to the village alderman 3 days later, is that at some point during that afternoon sitting, the carpenter removed the 2 pieces of cut cord from the apron pocket and looked at them for a while. And then the carpenter described what the cut ends looked like, and the village alderman wrote it down. And the village alderman said nothing publicly for 17 years, and when the village alderman finally did say something, the person the cord pointed toward was no longer in England. The formal record of what happened in the village of Wearmouth in 1349 occupies less than 1 page of parchment in the diocesan archive. The record notes that a man was incorrectly confirmed deceased and subsequently recovered. It notes the bell string mechanism. It does not mention the cut cord. This omission is itself a document. The things that are not written in medieval records are often more informative than the things that are. Historians call this the silence of the archive, and this particular silence is very loud. The first thing he wanted to see was the street, not his family, not the fire, not food or water, the street. He said later that he needed to see something that continued in the same direction as before, something that had not been interrupted by what had happened to him. The street was the same, the cobblestones, the timber buildings, the neighbors moving through the rain on their own business, the ordinary world continuing in the same direction. He stood at the window for a long time and let that sameness do what it needed to do. He would not leave the house for 11 days, not from illness. He recovered physically with remarkable speed, the way the body sometimes recovers when it has been conserving everything. He stayed inside because outside was where the box had been. Outside was where the grave had been dug, and outside was where, somewhere in the ordinary motion of the village, the person who had cut the bell string was also moving through rain-wet streets, going about evening activities, continuing in the same direction as the cobblestones and the timber buildings, and the dog moving through reflected lantern light. He asked the narrow brother one question that evening. He asked it quietly, in a voice still not fully recovered, in a room where two other people were present, and neither of them appeared to hear. He asked, who knew about the bell string? The narrow brother looked at him for a moment. Then the narrow brother counted on his fingers, quietly, one finger at a time. The carpenter, the two workshop men, the physician, the priest's young assistant, the older woman, the younger reddish-haired woman, and one other person, a person whose name the narrow brother said very quietly, leaning forward, and the thin pale man received it with absolutely no expression on his face. This is the person whose name was said quietly by the narrow brother, leaning forward by the fire. This is the person who knew about the bell string and had access to the box and possessed, by the standards of 1349 England, the one motivation that medieval law considered sufficient to examine a person's actions, the motivation of inheritance. The thin pale man had no children. His estate, small but real by village standards, passed to the nearest male relative on his death. That relative was this man, the man seated at the table with the wine cup and the document and the entirely composed expression. Sound of the rain, sound of the village, sound of absolutely nothing unusual happening in this room on this evening, in the way that nothing unusual happening can itself be the loudest sound in a room. The narrow brother walked through the rain for a long time that evening. He did not go anywhere specific. He was doing the thing that people do when they are carrying information that has weight but no clear destination, walking until the weight redistributes itself into something that can be carried without walking. He passed the carpenter's workshop with its shuttered window and its thin line of lantern light. He passed the church with its rain-darkened stone. He passed the graveyard. He stopped at the graveyard. He stood at the edge of it in the rain and looked at the open grave, still unfilled, the gravediggers having left it and gone in from the rain. He looked at it for a while. Then he walked back through the village toward the stone house. The grave was filled the following morning. One of the gravediggers came back with a spade and worked alone, the rain having stopped in the night, the morning cold and clear. He filled it in a little over an hour and pressed the earth flat with the back of the spade and set a simple wooden marker. The marker bore no name. The grave had been prepared for a specific person, but since that person had not died, the grave had no occupant to record. It was filled and marked and left. And in the village, people walked past it for years without knowing whose grave it almost was. Just a wooden marker in a row of wooden markers, slightly newer than the others, in earth that was slightly more recently disturbed than the rest. He lay awake through the early hours thinking about one specific thing, not the near burial, not the cut cord, not the person whose name the narrow brother had said quietly by the fire. He was thinking about the moment, the specific moment when he had been most completely between, not asleep, not fully awake, not dead, not fully alive. He was trying to remember what that moment felt like, and what he remembered, what he kept returning to, was not darkness, was not cold, was not fear. It was silence, a silence so complete that it had texture. And he thought about that silence for a very long time, staring at the stone ceiling while the village began its ordinary day outside. The box was eventually used. 4 days later, a different commission, a different person, a real death confirmed by every available method, checked twice. The physician called back a second time before the priest was contacted. The carpenter had added a step to the process, not because anyone had asked, just because the carpenter had been sitting with the 2 pieces of cut cord in a leather apron pocket, and the weight of them had produced a change in practice that no authority had mandated. The carpenter drilled the bell string hole in every box from that day forward, and tied the knot 3 times, and checked the ends. 3 days passed. During those 3 days, the thin, pale man recovered the full function of his body in careful stages, first sitting, then standing, then walking the length of the room, then the length of the house, then standing in the doorway looking at the street without stepping into it. On the 4th day, he asked the narrow brother to bring him the 2 pieces of cord. The narrow brother said the carpenter had them. The thin, pale man said he knew. He said, "Ask the carpenter for them." The carpenter went. The carpenter gave them. The thin, pale man held both pieces in his hands for a long time. He looked at the cut ends. Then he folded the cord pieces carefully and put them somewhere. He kept the cord for the rest of his life. This is documented. The cord pieces were found among his possessions when he died, of old age, 31 years later, in the same stone house, in the same village, in the same bed. They were in a small leather pouch beside his sleeping place. Nobody who catalogued his possessions after his death in 1380 knew what they were or why he had kept them. They were recorded as a length of old braided linen cord cut in 2. The leather pouch went to the narrow brother's son, who also did not know what it meant. The cord pieces were probably burned with the other household waste within a year. The knowledge of what they meant burned with them. He left 4 days after the thin, pale man sat up on the bed. He told the priest he had received word of business matters requiring his attention in the south. He told the village alderman the same thing. He left with 2 full leather bags on a well-fed dark bay horse. He did not return. This is recorded in the diocesan census. He does not appear in the village records after 1349. He appears in records of a town 60 miles south 2 years later, prosperous, established, apparently having arrived with sufficient resources to begin comfortably. The village alderman recorded his departure, noted the timing, said nothing publicly for 17 years, then said something. By then, the man in the dark blue wool tunic was no longer in England. On the 11th day, he stepped out of the doorway for the first time, 1 foot over the threshold onto the cobblestone, then the other. He stood in the street for approximately 1 minute before going back inside. The next day, he walked to the end of the lane. The day after that, he walked to the market square. The day after that, he walked to the church. He stood outside the church for a long time. He did not go in. He stood outside and looked at the stone walls and the iron-grilled windows and the smoke from the interior brazier and the door and everything the church contained behind the door, including the priest's account of what had almost happened. And then he walked home. He went to the grave on the 12th day. He stood there for a long time. The grave had no name on the marker because it had been prepared for him and he had not died, and so the marker recorded nothing, just a wooden stake in recently disturbed earth. He stood at the edge of it and looked at the marker and the earth and thought whatever a person thinks when they are standing at the edge of their own empty grave on a clear, cold English morning 31 days into the year 1350. Nobody recorded what he said, if he said anything. Nobody was there to record it. He came alone. He left alone. He did not come back to the graveyard for a very long time after that. He lived 31 more years in that village, in that house, in that room. He outlived the physician who had confirmed his death. He outlived the older woman who had been asleep in the chair when his eyelid moved. He outlived the priest. He outlived the narrow brother by 4 years. When he finally died, of old age, genuinely this time, confirmed by 2 physicians called simultaneously, the mirror test conducted 3 times, the carpenter who built his actual burial box was the son of the carpenter who had built the first one. The bell string was fitted with a new cord, freshly tied, the ends checked. The hole in the lid was drilled the same way. The bell was the same size. The only difference was that this time the cord was whole, and the man inside the box genuinely, finally, completely did not need it.